I'm really glad we're going to be going out of the morning's presentations with a different kind of experience that often comes up in the conflict resolution world, and that is, how do you encourage nonviolent protest or resistance? This next presentation is really a different audience than those that we've been looking at earlier. You know, we've been pretty much, if you thought about the target audience for most of what we've seen this morning, it's really pretty much folks who you know, in an organizational context, either government or NGO or another organizational context where you want to give them training to improve their decision-making around unpredictable circumstances that they are likely to encounter in the future. You remember, that's how we set up the day. But this is really quite different, what we're going to see from the folks at A Force More Powerful. Really the target audience for this is really people. People in the streets, people in civil society, people in any country where there is a repressive regime that really needs to change. I'll let them go into that and talk about what it's about in a moment. But let me just introduce the two fellows that I've got here. And as a former documentary filmmaker myself, I know the impact of Steve York's work very well. I'm proud to have him speaking here today. He's a veteran documentary filmmaker, worked in Europe, Asia, Africa, North and South America, on subjects ranging from religious fundamentalism to American history to nonviolent conflict. And the video game that we're about to see really started as a documentary film project. 1997, Steve began development on an examination of the history of nonviolent conflict. A Force More Powerful then debuted as a feature-length documentary film in the fall of 1999. And was very successful, expanded into a 3-hour series for broadcast on National Public Television in 2000. And then Steve went on to work with some other folks in this room, Peter Ackerman over there, who really supported the development of the transformation of this powerful film into a computer strategy game. And A Force More Powerful was released in 2005, where, as you'll see, the player acts as a strategist in simulated nonviolent struggles against dictators, authoritarians, and other oppressors. Steve's colleague, who's also going to be driving us through this presentation, has also an extraordinary resume. Ivan Marovic, born in Belgrade, Serbia, is one of the founders of Otpor. Some of you might know of Otpor, a student resistance movement that played a very, very important role in the downfall of Milosevic in 2000. And Ivan was a very public figure there, speaking out often at rallies and marches in very dangerous times. And after the successful transition in Serbia, he became a leading trainer in the field of strategic nonviolent conflict and worked with Steve on the development of this very powerful video game that we're going to see here today. So it really is my pleasure. Steve, Ivan, take it away.
Thank you, Sheldon. I'm a filmmaker, and that's a fancy way of saying that I tell stories, so I'm going to try to tell you a story this morning. Particularly, I think it's important to understand how we came to be here. 6 years ago, as Sheldon explained, with no prior experience and not really knowing where it would take me, I became involved in creating a game. More precisely, a computer-based strategy game. The game has been out for 3 years. We learned a lot from having done the game and from the feedback that we got from users of that game. I'm going to show you the game. There it is. That's as much as you're going to see of it, but at least, you know, here it is. The most important thing that came out of this game, frankly, is a series of lessons that gave us the ammunition, so to speak, to produce another game. So almost 2 years ago, we began development of what I think we probably would have thought was going to be version 2. In fact, it's a completely different game. It's not a version 2. It'll have a completely different title. It's about, we're 10 days or so away from going into beta testing. And Ivan is going to show you some bits from that game in a few minutes. He's been playing games for 20 years, which is 5 times longer than I have. Although he got involved in game making at about the same time I did, his role this morning is going to be a lot bigger than mine for reasons which will be obvious. Before we talk about games, I want to be sure, though, that everyone here understands which ballpark we're playing in. This is the United States Institute of Peace. The very first words out of Sheldon's mouth this morning when he introduced the Institute, to those of you who are not so familiar with it, were prevention and resolution. Prevention of conflict and resolution of conflict. The work that we have done and what's involved in both our first game and the new one occupy territory between conflict prevention and conflict resolution. We are concerned about what happens when prevention fails and the conflict occurs, but before it's ripe for resolution. That is a period when there's actually a conflict occurring. So we are interested, and I repeat, not in preventing. We are interested, but our concern with the game is to deal with that area between prevention and resolution where a conflict has to be waged, and with a particular type of conflict, which is one that dramatically reduces or even eliminates in some cases the deadliness and the destructiveness of armed conflict. Whatever you call it, people power, civil resistance, mass action, nonviolent struggle, it has a much better success rate than it gets credit for. Think of what Gandhi did in India, about the civil rights movement here in the United States, the triumph of solidarity in Poland. What happened to Ferdinand Marcos, Pinochet, Milosevic, the dismantling of apartheid? These were nonviolent success stories. I don't have time for the whole list, but let me just say, in 2005, a study concluded that civil resistance was the key factor in 50 of 67 transitions in the last 33 years. Stated slightly differently, in 70% of countries where transitions involved the defeat of dictators and authoritarians, civil resistance was the key factor. There's a better track record than violent insurrection, to tell you the truth. I mean, that's just a simple fact. Civil resistance as an inspiration for this game, or for both of our games, began when we, by which I mean especially my colleagues at the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, prodded and with cheerleading from Peter Ackerman, who's sitting with us this morning, started thinking about how people could acquire the skills required to wage a nonviolent struggle. We knew a few things. We knew that success depends very, very much on skills. We knew that the ability to think strategically ranks very, very high on the list of skills. We knew that the ability is rarely instinctive and not easily learned from books. We saw that simulations and games were being used effectively to teach strategy in the field of business and to teach military strategy. I should add parenthetically that while the weapons are very, very different, nonviolent strategies and military strategies have a great deal in common. So the decision to develop a computer-based strategy game was not a difficult one at all. Such a game we felt would provide a kind of zero-risk opportunity to learn by doing. I had more to say on this, but frankly, the comments made in the Sense presentation earlier today apply equally to what we've done. Sheldon has already covered a lot of what I had to say, and I can skip ahead, fortunately. In 3 years, we've shipped about 12,000 copies of this. We've done no advertising of any kind. It's been kind of a viral marketing scheme. One of the problems is that I don't know, and I wish we did know more about what people are actually doing with this game. We know it's being used in high school and university classrooms, sometimes as a course requirement. But outside the United States, as for what's being done with this game by people who are engaged in their own struggles in places like Zimbabwe, Belarus, Burma, Iran, it's hard to know. By the way, the discs, the CDs in this game are not copy protected. This is intentional because we wanted to encourage piracy. So not something that commercial game developers have in mind, but it was very important to us. And I have friends in Ukraine, for example, who tell me that they have made hundreds and hundreds of copies, and those copies have been carried into Russia, Belarus, Moldova, the stands. We're acquainted with movements in other countries, including Iran, where the game is being used by activists and strategists. Just think of what that means. Books could be written about what we learned from making the first game. No one would read them. There would be a very frustrating kind of story to read, but as those of you who've been involved in game development certainly understand. But instead of writing a book or books, we incorporated those lessons into the new game. And it's not a version 2, as I said, it's quite a different game. Ivan will show you some bits about it and talk about, very briefly I hope, our plan is to leave the maximum amount of time for questions and answers. Frankly, we could talk to you about artificial intelligence, we could talk about platforms, we could talk about modeling, we could talk about algorithms, we could talk about how do you find funding for a game like this, what they cost, how do you choose designers and developers. You may be interested in any or all of those things, but we'd like to respond and focus what we have to say to your questions and curiosity. So we won't try to run through all of that. We'll just take questions. But Sheldon was terrific in providing a little bit of background on who Ivan Marovic is. I would just say that he's been an asset beyond anything that I could describe because he combines the fact that he's a veteran of a nonviolent struggle, a very successful one, with a tremendous knowledge of and interest in games and strategic gaming and strategy. So, Ivan.
So, this is the game that we're going to show is, as Steve said, the new game, which was pretty much based on the feedback that we got from people who played the first game. And without showing you the last game, I will just explain that, you know, when you start the last game, you get this view from the skies on a city, and you can see people walking, and you see different buildings, and you click on buildings, and there are different ministries and different agencies, government agencies, different civil organizations, whatever. And then you move through this world and discover it, and as you discover what's going on there, you then pick different tactics and try to change the circumstances in that country in the game. And as a feedback from players, they actually pretty much didn't like this God view, because they said, when I go to my organization in my country, you know, I don't have this view from the skies where I can see everything. I pretty much have to explore this from a really small and crammy office. So what what came out of that was actually, you will see in a second. Is a really crammy office. So instead of having this classic approach of many strategy games, which actually the last game was pretty much influenced by that, we decided to have a completely different approach. So now when you start the game, you just go into the office and you pretty much have to explore the world around you. So it's a turn-based game, so whenever you are ready, whenever you know enough, you can advance turn and then go to the next day. So this is January 2nd, January 3rd, etc., etc. So how would a player go into the game? There are several how shall I say, items on this screen, but it's pretty much intuitive. So by clicking on some of them, you will actually get to explore what is going on. For instance, this is the conference room, where you will go to the and you will be able to talk to your colleagues in the movement. So what you actually get is some sort of report on what is going on. For instance, you will see what is the credibility of the movement, which is at the moment 0 in every region in the game. But you will see how many committed activists you have. You have 0 committed activists. So we're at the very beginning of the game. You will see, what is your character that has the highest public profile, Aldo Vidal in this case. So this is kind of your asset that you can use, Or you can click to some other advisor, and he can give you actually a report on what is going on in different parts of the country. So, for instance, what is the hardship in that part of the country, awareness, etc., etc., awareness of the situation, and these kind of things. So, another thing that you can do is actually, and this is like what you see here is still placeholder art, and we're still in the development, so it will look a bit different. But you can also read what is going on and try to figure out. So President declares state of emergency. President Valerio Sanchez warns the opposition. He gave a speech yesterday in which he warned the opposition that their subversive activities in Costa Selva will not be tolerated anymore. So you get the news about what's going on. You can read the information about, and you kind of, in the first 15 minutes of the game, you explore what is going on. If you want to go deeper, and this is, I think the biggest difference is from the previous game, we actually included something that people know as tactical mapping of networks and social networks, and something that we call in this game affiliation diagram. So you can actually go and pick any character in the game, and when you pick the character, you can actually see the connections that he has. At this moment, this guy, for instance, has very few connections. For instance, this guy has for instance, Valerio Sanchez has a connection to the Sanchez administration. If you click on the Sanchez administration, you will actually see that they have a connection with this other fellow. So the idea here is that you get to know the society that you're operating in. And that doesn't mean just, knowing the stats, like what are the economic conditions, what is the level of legitimacy and support for the regime, etc., but also going down to the very little details of who knows whom, because that is very important to conduct tactics. And now we come to the final part of this before we go to Q&A, and this is how you influence events in the game. And events in the game are influenced through tactics. So what you actually do in the game is, after learning after you learn about the situation in the country, after you know about all the agents, you actually get to conduct tactics. For instance, Adam Gutierrez can organize a meeting, for instance, on the 7th of January. Puff, it is scheduled. I will just leave this to show you another part of this product, of this game, which is actually a separate piece of software, but it's, so we're going to the same thing that we just saw, but now we're looking at the same thing from the scenario builder. And the scenario builder is a tool set that we are going to ship with the game, where people will be able to make their own scenarios. What they will be able to do is define regions in the game. So we have the regions that we saw in the presentation. To define cities and their population, etc., etc. To define the list of political issues. To define all the ethnic, religious, and other communities that are present in the country. Then to define personality traits for different agents in the game, adventurous, ambitious, bold, whatever. Define characters and groups. together with their affiliations and networks. Also, set up tactics that are available for the agents in the game, for characters and groups in the game. And another thing is, set up needs so that every character and the group in the game will have a set of needs that they would like to fulfill. And of course, write news items. For instance, this is the news item that we just saw in the game when President declared state of emergency. So as a result of this, the player or the scenario designer in this case will be able to model a game around an existing or a fictional country. So what we're going to have when the game is launched is a website where people will be able to download the game, where they will be able to download the scenario builder, when they will be able to build their own scenarios, post them on the website, share them with others, and these can be scenarios about Burma, about Iran today. There can be scenarios about colonial India back in 1947, whatever they wish. But what we think is going to come out of it is that other people are going to play their games, their scenarios, and the discussion around what would be the best strategy in this particular situation is going to come out of playing this game. What I believe, and I think Peter and Steve share the same thing, is that when people do things on their own and where people can train themselves, that is much more powerful and has much more influence than any kind of targeted training or targeted communication that would come from one center. So I come from a background of a trainer, and I used to go and do workshops in places like Ukraine or Lebanon or other places, and I could reach only a limited number of people in those trainings. The workshops were like 20 people or 25 people, and it would last for 3 days, and that's it. When we made the first game, the outreach was a little bit bigger because there was a disc that you could ship, and this can reach more people than one person. And what we are moving to now is a downloadable game where people can make their own scenarios, and who knows how many people this can reach at least. And I think we can move to questions now, because I think you have the idea of what this game can achieve, but I would rather get to the question.
Okay, let's take some questions back there, folks who.
Yes, Pauline Baker. Is this under the question of tactics? How does the tool teach civil society how to organize to achieve their goals rather than just different scenarios and different options? What's the teaching component? How do you build in the lessons learned from previous uses to educate the user rather than every user starting from ground zero? Yeah. In other words, how do you make it an action tool?
Yeah. Well, there are two components of that. First one is the scenario building, which will be done. Let's say if we look at the total audience of the game of 100%, maybe 10 to 20% will be people who are going to build scenarios. The remaining 80% are just going to play the scenarios that are already built. So it's a much bigger audience. And for those 80%, which are actually the main audience, when they play the game, they will actually go through the process of organization management, campaign management, tactical sequencing, managing of resources, both human and material resources, establishing communication with different groups, both inside and outside. And they're going to go through the process of learning how to think strategically, to make the right choice, and to think about all the important details that are necessary to make a sustainable effort.
Prompts them,
yes.
Lets them to do these things. Are there guidances? Like how you said that it prompts them to make the right choices. How do you know whether your choice is right or wrong?
Well, the good thing about the game is you can make a wrong choice and without much cost. So the main thing is not so much to guide them what to do, but actually to show them what happens when they do something. So if they make a wrong choice in the game, they will learn that this wasn't a good idea after all. But because it's a game, it's not the real world, they can always go back and try it again and try something else. So learning by doing is actually what we want to have in this game. But learning by doing usually becomes learning on your own mistakes. And we encourage people to play the game and to make mistakes because it's much less costly to make mistakes in the game than to make them in the real life. But you know, as you saw, the game itself is pretty much set up so you can actually explore it, and you can go deeper into the game as you wish. And what we think that people are going to do is actually when they play it over and over again, they will actually go and pay attention to more detail than they did in the beginning. For instance, if I play the game for the first time, I will probably schedule a couple of tactics and try to do randomly. The result is not going to be as good. Then I'm going to try it again. Then I go to the affiliation diagram and see who is connected to whom and try to plan things to make a bigger effect. But the idea is that people improve their strategic planning skills and their management skills for any kind of political organizing on the grassroots level by playing this game.
Ivan, is that functionality available in the scenario builder piece?
Well, yeah, the scenario builder actually is more a tool that helps you make a scenario about a particular country. Because when we started making this, you know, it was the main issue that we struggled with was, you know, how can I make a scenario about North Korea, or how can I make a scenario about, I don't know, Lebanon, when I didn't live there, I don't know, you know, the culture, I don't know all the details of their political system, economic, whatever. But if we give the scenario tool to people who know that, they just input this data, and when they start the game, actually, I can play then a good scenario about Lebanon or a good scenario about North Korea because it was done by people who know that better. So in that sense, scenario builder is just a tool that actually allows people to build virtual countries based on real countries or based on fictional countries and play the game in them.
Some of the folks back here.
Thank you. Gary Milante, World Bank. But this is more of a game question. And I think when we compare this to icons and we're considering it, we see real two ends of the spectrum on the decision-making process of how to model these kinds of relationships. In icons, it's very facilitated. It's very facilitated, and it's made by the kind of decision-making process and the methodology for resolving conflicts is made by a facilitator. In A Force More Powerful, we saw a lot of characteristics, skills. We see a lot of quantifying, which we also saw in Sense. Can you give us some reflections on how you chose that level of quantification and modeling for the simulation, and how us as game designers should be thinking about these kinds of things?
I think there is a big difference in the approach that we took last time and the approach that we took this time. This time, I think we spent like probably 50% of the total energy trying to build a model that will work. And when I say model, our AI expert, Brian Schwab, who was pretty much involved in the whole concept of designing the artificial intelligence behind the game, he actually said, you know, every little character in the game has to have a personality and has to have a set of needs, you know, because we want them to do things even when the player does nothing. You know, they're engaging in their own little, you know, activity. You know, so modeling was very important actually, and the testing of those models is also very important because we want to have people who are we want to allow people to understand that nonviolent conflict, as any other conflict, is a dynamic phenomenon, and that you have to constantly think about what's coming next and to prepare for that and to build your momentum in this process. Because without this momentum, there can hardly be any advances in the struggle. So, because most important tactics in the game for winning the scenario are things things like strikes and boycotts and mass acts of civil disobedience, and for that you need to have general public on your side. So for that, you need to kind of have active approach to win the general public on your side, and they're engaged and they're very much committed, and then they go into the streets as we saw in Iran a few weeks ago. But to have all that, you kind of have to plan early and to start little by making smaller and small victories in the beginning, and then bigger and bigger victories in order to make this momentum. As it starts going, then actually things become much easier. So in that sense, this sort of dynamic modeling was I think something that was very important and that made I think it's going to make a very, very big difference.
All right, we can take two more before we go to the online folks.
Andrew Oken, American Go Association. Is the model public? Can you play characters other than the nonviolent dissenter? And will the model produce elaborate behavior given enough stuff? In the scenario builder, if you create two ethnic groups and a nonviolent person is associated with one, will General Sanchez automatically get the other one to start doing ethnic cleansing or ethnic mobilizing?
Well, that's a great question, and we will now reveal what's coming after the game is launched. When we finish this game this fall, you will only be able to play the nonviolent movement against the repressive regime, and this is like the first step. But as soon as this is launched, we're adding two add-ons. We start working on two add-ons. The first add-on is like an expansion where people will be able to play the regime, and the second is where people will be able to play a group that is not strictly nonviolent. Actually, a group that can actually... the reason why we wanted to have that is to kind of give the broad spectrum of all the possibilities in a conflict. And we didn't want to have people saying to us, well, you're just making this game to promote a particular form of conflict, but actually what you did and your model that you made is actually skewed to favor nonviolent conflict. So what we're going to do is open it up so that people can, and of course the model to make it public and to open it up to look at the conflict from different perspectives, including the regime perspective, so that you can actually play that. For your second question, depends on how you make the Sanchez administration. If the Sanchez administration is very pragmatic and doesn't have any animosities towards certain ethnic groups, or the level of these animosities can vary, Sanchez administration can actually make a decision to use them for ethnic cleansing against the other group. But it largely depends on Sanchez administration, which is run by the computer. This is the regime, and depending on what kind of regime you make as a scenario designer. So in this particular scenario that we looked at, Sanchez administration would never do that. But if you go into the scenario builder and you change them and you make them a little bit more brutal, then they would do it.
And that behavior would arise automatically?
So that behavior would arise as a result of artificial intelligence decision, which is built in the game.
Okay, take one more.
Peggy Oriani, Windwalker Corporation. I have two questions. The first is, this sounds an awful lot like an MMO, but I'm thinking maybe this is single player.
Yeah, it is single player.
Single player. And regardless of that, it seems like you are intending to leverage the power and the knowledge of the gaming community in order to bring things along. So where you have saved yourself the task of mailing discs this time around, you've given yourself another task of fostering that community and providing the tools and the rankings and the communication and the events and the monitoring that goes along with building and fostering a thriving community. So
exactly. This is,
okay.
The community. You saved me. You helped me a lot with this question, actually, because this is one thing that I failed to mention, and that is that community is going to be the key. Although this is a single-player game, and people won't be able to engage in massive multiplayer as with some other games, they will be able to engage in massive scenario building and exchange of these ideas. So the idea is when the game is launched, we have a website with a community, with rankings and reviews of different scenarios, and people are going to be able to, play other people's scenarios, write reviews, recommend them, etc., etc. So it's not just for activists. If we talk about like a scenario, I mentioned, somebody making a scenario about, I don't know, a particular country, let's say Serbia. Somebody makes a scenario about Serbia. It's not just that people who live in Serbia or who want to get involved in some sort of social movement, that it's not just that they will play the scenario, but somebody who lives abroad and who wants to learn about what's going on there, this is another way to learn. It's not the same as reading newspapers and stuff. It's more interactive, but also that opens up the whole other thing. Then what about universities? If somebody has a university course where they want to learn about a particular country or a particular region and the problems that they're facing, one of the ways they can actually learn that is by playing one of those scenarios. So in that sense, that opens up a whole range of possibilities.
All right. Going to the online folks with questions.
There is a lot of interest online and many enthusiastic voices about the user-based content and crowdsourcing the scenario development. So there's lots of people self-identifying to be part of that community. We've made a note to them that they can work through us to connect to you. The other interesting parallel conversation that's been going on, I'll sum up as, can a game this realistic be fun? One comment, it's very interesting how they developed the ability to understand the social networks of the various characters in the game. I just wonder if it's too much reading, not enough playing for a game. And put another way, any game that's fun allows violence in some ways. So what's your take on that?
Okay, from
Fun factor.
this game, even this first release, will have violence. The regime will be able to conduct violence, and so the only problem is that you, as a player, you will only be the victim of violence. So, but there will be violence. But the idea here is that we want to empower people and to train them and to teach them with the game to use nonviolent methods actually to confront violence of the regime. And these things worked in the real world, so they will work in the game as well. Fun versus, we try to balance that. And what we try to do is to have the least possible amount of text for the game to be operational. So you won't be required to read a lot, but there are lots of graphs and there are lots of, how shall I say, different diagrams that you can use to figure out what is going on. But it's still not the same level of fun as people have when they're killing dragons and exploring fictional worlds. But it is a different kind of fun which people can have if, and that fun comes from like planning a successful strategy and then putting all wheels in motion and then watching things unfold. And there is fun in doing that. I tried it in the real world, and I tell you, it's really good.
I see Peter's interested in jumping in. You've heard the reference to Peter Ackerman as one of the folks that was at the core of the development of this game and documentary film. Peter, you've got the last word here.
I wasn't at the core. I just saw that a game would satisfy a need. Many people have seen movies Steve's produced and have come to us and said, we want to do what they're doing. And then they would say, but our situation's completely different. And we would concede the fact that each situation is. They have their own ethnic configurations, their own bureaucracies, their own business communities, their own military structures. But at the end of the day, and the reason why we've done many, many stories is to show that the dynamics, the strategic dynamics as to what makes civil resistance succeed is the same. So what we try to do is bring them to that commonality, that strategic core. And the strategic core in civil resistance is to create disruptions for the purpose of allowing loyalty shifts. If you look at most of our movies, the reason why they succeed at the end is because there's been defections in the military. This fall, you'll see the movie that Steve produced called Orange Revolution, and that's a story about how Putin and Kuchma wanted to get the military out to basically disperse people who were in the Maidan for 14 days in the freezing cold to get an election reversed. And the military basically called the opposition and said, this is what you're going to do, so we're going to basically help us disobey what we've been told to do. So civil resistance is about the creation of loyalty shifts. And if you think about that, you realize that in each of the affiliations that Yvonne is talking about, each person has within them the possibility for a loyalty shift based both on preference and the risks they're willing to take. This game allows you to tease out with some level of confidence whose loyalties can be shifted in a sequential game mode. Now, I'm sorry if it's not sufficient fun, but from my point of view, this is a serious game because people's lives are at stake, their freedoms are at stake. And it's our hope that when people play this game in a more digestible format, which we have for the second effort, that this will basically give people confidence to act. It will very specifically help Iranians to deal with the repression they're dealing with now and to increase the likelihood of their success. That's the point of the game.
So let's be clear, when is the next version to hit the streets?
So the next version will hit the streets this fall. We have the October 1st as the deadline, but don't take our word for it. Maybe it will be October 10th or something.
Okay.
But definitely, we are about to start beta testing on August 1st, and depending on how well this goes, it can go from 4 weeks to 8 weeks of beta testing, which is most of the things that you saw now is placeholder art, and it's really, we were mostly focusing on the model and underlying math. So now we have to spend 2 months polishing this so it looks better, and as soon as we finish that, it will be
Great.
It will be up there on the web.
All right. So thank you very much. We'll all be looking for this in the fall.